try to get the camera out of the way. There we go. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for the introduction and also the invitation. So as Hannah explained, I'm based at the University of St Andrews. I'm also an honorary fellow of the Scottish Association of Marine Science, and I'm really pleased to be here today and talk to you about electromagnetic fields and their effects on marine species. So just by a brief overview, I'll start the talk by introducing why we care about and EMFs and also what electromagnetic fields are. I'll take a moment to describe how we can take the vantage point of receptive species to better understand how they may respond to EMFs. I'll also go over the knowledge base that we currently have and what it is that we know about how animals respond to EMFs. I'll then briefly describe the patchwork of information and the methods that we've used to get that information. And then revisiting why it's important for us to consider this as a topic, I'll highlight how we can improve on the knowledge base that we currently have. Okay, so I wanted to start with a kind of explanation as to what an electromagnetic field is. And one of the most dominant electromagnetic fields that exists is the geomagnetic field. So that actually comes from the Earth. And this is an outreach poster from NOAA, which I thought captured it really well, not only with the scale of the electromagnetic field, but also to highlight that we are completely surrounded by it. And whether we realise it or not, we actually use the geomagnetic field to help us in everyday life. Although we do it differently to the way that animals respond to it. So the geomagnetic field across the whole globe ranges between 25 and 65 microtesla. And while animals are able to sense that directly, we rely on models. So this is the modelled geomagnetic field. And it's these models and maps that we use in our ability to use compasses or technology such as phones to locate where we are. Animals, on the other hand, can sense it directly or indirectly, and in the marine environment, they're also able to detect the emotionally induced electric field that arises from either an organism or a water body moving through the magnetic field. And in addition to that, they are able to sense the bioelectric fields, and that arises from things such as muscular movements or ionic flows, such as the movement of over Gill membranes and such like. And so the reason why we care about this is because these cues that I just described can provide ecologically important information to the marine animals that can sense them. And they can use these cues to identify their predators or detect prey. They might be able to use them to identify their mates or to communicate with their conspecifics. In addition to that, they can obtain information that helps them to orientate themselves, and that can be useful in terms of homing, such as to get back to a den, or in long distance migrations as well. So there's a whole variety of ways in which it's important to marine animals, and the animals that are able to respond to these we call receptive species, so they are the receptors, and in this case the pressure is the electromagnetic field. And you really need information from both of those knowledge bases to be able to make management decisions as to how our actions influence the marine environment and the cues that animals rely on. One of the reasons that this is a topic of importance at the moment is due to the expansion of offshore energy, and that can take a variety of forms. We're obviously most familiar with wind, but it can also be wave and tidal energy in our marine environment. And we have a variety of offshore wind farms already in place with planning and in some cases construction already underway. We have a rather large commitment to get 40 gigawatts by 2030 as well. And recently you'll have seen the ScotWind programme where there are additional leases available around Scotland. And we also have similar initiative in England where you have the round 4 seabed bidding areas. Of course, it's a global expansion, it's not just the UK. There's a number of different countries that are undertaking these kind of initiatives as well. And just by way of example, so this is Block Island Wind Farm, and you can see the northeastern coast of America where there's a great deal of offshore wind planned for the future. So with this global expansion of offshore energy, we'll introduce more subsea cables into our coastal and offshore waters. And these come in the form of inter-array cables and export cables. And so if I draw your attention here, this is Beatrice offshore wind farm on the northeast coast of Scotland, and you can see the export cable here going to land, and that connects the energy production to the grid. So if you zoom in on Beatrice, you can see the inter-array cables and the network of cables that are actually existing within the offshore wind farm, and you can see the export cables that are leaving the wind farm there. And as another example, this is Hornsea, so you can see the inter-array cables and the network that's provided there, and you can also see multiple export cables that are going along the same route to land. And in addition, this is the Walney extension, where you can see, again, the inter-array cables and multiple export cables. And this also demonstrates the increased density as you get closer to shore, and also the crossing of the paths of the cables as well. So it's not a small undertaking. There will be a lot more cables as we expand the offshore energy industry, and they will likely increase in capacity as well as number and cover greater distances as we move further offshore. So subsea cables can take a variety of different forms. They can be low, medium or high voltage, and they can also be AC or DC. AC is more frequently used with offshore wind energy at the moment. However, direct current cables are employed, and they're expected to increase in the number as we move further offshore and increase those capacities. Typically, cables are thought to be a benthic issue because traditionally with the fixed types of devices that we've had, or the bottom fixed devices, cables are typically laid on the seabed or in the seabed. So cables can be buried, or if they're on the seabed, they're quite often protected by concrete mattresses and rock armouring. And regardless as to where the position of the cable is, the electromagnetic field is emitted into the surrounding environment. With the advancement of floating offshore winds, we now also have cables in the pelagic environment, so cables that are actually in the water column. And these are called dynamic cables. And while this is an oversimplification of how they may be presented, it highlights that the cables are no longer just a benthic issue, not just responsive to benthic species, but also to pelagic species as well. And as demonstrated with the maps in the previous slides of the offshore wind farms that exist, you can have a variety of different cable configurations for the export cable. So you might have singular export cables from offshore wind farms, or you could have multiple cables that come together in a cable corridor, or alternatively, you could have an offshore energy collection platform collecting that energy, and then a higher capacity cable feeding that energy to shore. So I'll try to explain what an electromagnetic field is, and just to highlight that we are talking about the marine environment in these scenarios. So the most important thing to realise is that there are two interacting components, that is the electric field and the magnetic field. They come together, that's the electromagnetic field. There are some differences and similarities between AC and DC cables, which I'll try to highlight at the moment. So this is a cross-section, the orange dot is the cross-section of the cable. When a voltage is applied to a cable and the current passes through it, an electric field is produced, and that is actually contained within the cable sheathing. However, the magnetic field is not able to be contained, and that passes freely into the surrounding environment, which in this case is the marine environment. In the case of the AC cable, you also have an induced electric field associated with the magnetic field. And in both the DC and AC cable scenarios, you have the ability to have a motionally induced electric field, which arises from either an object, such as a fish or a water body, passing through the magnetic field. So that gives rise to the motionally induced electric field. So they're the different components that make up the electromagnetic field. And then, so although I've shown that in 2 dimensions, it is actually a 3-dimensional entity. So just again, as the current passes through the cable, the electric field is produced in the same plane, and then the magnetic field is emitted in perpendicular, so 90 degrees from the electric field, and then the induced electric field may come from motion through the magnetic field. So as I highlighted, cables can take a variety of different forms in the marine environment now. If we focus on the buried cable here, I can show you an example of a model of an AC cable. So this is an AC cable just below the seabed. It's buried at 1 metre, and the top image here is the magnetic field. And you can see that the magnetic field passes freely through the seabed and into the sea unaltered. It doesn't matter which substrate it's passing through, the magnetic field is a constant. through both of those substrates. In comparison, the electric field is different through the seabed and the sea, and that's due to the difference in the conductivity of the medium. So in the seawater, the conductivity amplifies the electric field more so than it would do through the seabed. And so when we talk about the electromagnetic fields from cables, we very much focus on the magnetic field, and these are usually modelled. So I just wanted to share some examples of those models with you. And these are actually from Norman Doe back in 2011, and they pulled the information from a variety of different reports and then did their own models because there was quite a lot of variation as to how they were reported. And so the DC cables on the left-hand side, you can see that the magnetic field tends to be higher. The scale runs much higher than it does for the AC field, which have a tendency to be lower. And that's actually associated with the capacity of the cable and the amount of energy that they're able to transfer. Although I'll also draw your attention to the fact that you have different intensities of electromagnetic fields from different cables in both cases. And in addition to that, you have different shapes. And so the distance along the seabed is variable depending on the cable properties as well. And that cue at the bottom there is to highlight the cross sound cable to you, because that's one of the cables that we've been working on, which is a 330 megawatt cable, and it's a transmission cable in the US and Long Island Sound. We actually modelled and measured the EMF from that cable. And so in the top here, you can see a model. This is the seabed. So the cable is actually buried in the seabed, and this is the magnetic field as it's emitted into the seawater. You can see that the intensity changes as you move further away from the cable, both vertically and horizontally. And you can plot these intensities. So this is the blue line is the intensity at the seabed, and in 0.5 meter steps, you have a reduction in the intensity as you move further away. And so we actually, as well as modelling the electromagnetic fields, we measured it. And you can see that there is, when you go out and measure it, there's actually a variety of magnetic field signatures that are obtained from the same cable, but in different positions. So as you go along the cable route, there is a variation in the magnetic field that's emitted. And if I draw your attention to the fact that you don't only just have the increase in magnetic fields, you also have a decrease, and it takes different shapes and forms. In addition to the DC magnetic field, we also measured an unexpected AC field. Now, we were working on a DC cable, so we certainly didn't expect that. However, the AC magnetic field was actually a greater spatial extent than the DC field, and the electric field was a much further spatial extent again. And so the modelled scenario is a simplification as to what the actual emitted electromagnetic field would be in this case. And I should say that the AC field is measured on other DC cables, so it's not a one-time only event. So just taking us back to the Earth's magnetic field and how this varies. So you'll remember that I said that the magnetic field over the course of the globe varies between 25 and 65 microtesla, which is actually 25,000 to 65,000 nanotesla. So this line here is 50,000 nanotesla, up here is 55, and down here is 45. And this is a three-dimensional entity to which animals are responsive to. And when you model the electromagnetic field focused on the magnetic field, very often what you hear is that the magnetic field is below the local Earth's magnetic field. And so the insinuation is that it doesn't really matter then. But hopefully, as I've just demonstrated through measuring the electromagnetic field, it's not necessarily that simple. There are complexities. They are both three-dimensional entities that interact with each other. And so we really need to consider how the species of interest perceive their electromagnetic environment and how that may be changed by the cable EMFs that we are introducing. And in order to do that, I would like to suggest that we should be taking the vantage point of the receptive species. And by that, what I mean is that we actually take their position in space and time and consider how they perceive their sensory environment, and specifically which cues it is that are important to them at that time and how they may be altered. And so in order to really look at to adopt the vantage point of the receptive species, there's a number of layers of information that need to be pulled together, and we'll just briefly go through them now. So at the very core of our understanding as to how a receptive species may respond to EMFs is their ability to detect or sense their electrosensory environment. Magnetosensitivity is something that's quite broadly applicable to a variety of taxa, both terrestrial and marine, although we don't necessarily have the best understanding of the exact mechanisms as to how they do it. What we can say though is that species are said to have either a magnetic map sense or a magnetic compass sense, and that allows them to determine their position in space and also to assist them in reaching a goal. In terms of electroreception, we have a better understanding of the physiological apparatus, both in terms of the lateral lines and ampullary organs that different species have. And our best understanding comes from the ampullae of Lorenzini and the elasmobranchs. Although there's also recent evidence to suggest that some species may have magnetosensitive and electrosensitive apparatus, both physiological sets. And so that could be more complex as well. In terms of their detection ranges, we don't have particularly well-defined information for the different species that can detect these things. But what we can presume is that they're responsive to the geomagnetic field. And as we just showed with the map, it's not just the global change, but the gradient of change in the localities to which they're responding to. So that's most likely in the range of nanotesla to microtesla, and smaller than that even. And with the bioelectric fields that species are responsive to, they can be AC and DC fields, and they're also typically of low frequencies and low voltages. So that's what we understand about the detection ranges of the different species, most of which comes from elasmobranchs. We also have to consider how the perception of electromagnetic fields may change through the life history of a species, not just in terms of how their sensory abilities may develop, but also in terms of how their biological function or ecological context changes. So as an example, we can look at the elasmobranchs in skates and rays. We've demonstrated experimentally that the ability to detect bioelectric fields actually starts very early on while they're still in egg cases. And at that point, it could be important to them as a predator detection mechanism, whereas later on in life, it might become important to them to detect prey or mates. And so that ecological context can change as well. In addition to that, the life histories of the species that we could well be interested in are highly variable, and they interact with both the benthic and the pelagic environment in different ways. And so that brings me to the next layer of information, which is the movement ecology, and how that might inform us of how a species may encounter a cable EMF. And by that, I mean that we have to consider both their vertical and horizontal movements in space and how that changes through time. Although we like to talk about benthic and pelagic species, we know that they don't necessarily neatly fit into these categorizations. And even a pelagic species may come into contact with a benthic bottom-mounted cable if it's an important feeding ground for them. We also need to consider how often it is that they're likely to come into contact with a cable EMF, and where they encounter multiple cables if they're able to learn from previous experience. Is habituation something that's possible across the species that we're interested in? So I'll just briefly go through some of the known effects, and in doing so, I'll present a photograph or like an image of the species of interest, which is just representative. It's not necessarily accurate to the species I'm talking about. I'll highlight some of the studies below that, and also produce some symbols to help identify the different kinds of studies that have taken place. So starting deliberately broad, we know that even bacteria can be magnetotactic, and through natural studies, we have established that they can respond to the geomagnetic field. And so it is possible that changes in bacterial communities may occur. I also became aware of some studies at the MASTS conference that are taking place in the responses of biofilm forming organisms to the responses of magnetic fields produced by Helmholtz coils in aquariums. That's what the HH means. And a similar type or similar types of studies have also revealed that polychaetes can be responsive to magnetic fields, and they have actually shown changes in their burrowing activity in response to magnetic fields. Similarly, in bivalves, we have identified physiological responses, so changes in the immunological pathways and heat shock proteins. And in addition to that, for some of these invertebrates shown, there have been cytotoxic and genotoxic effects detected in response to magnetic fields. Moving on to crustaceans, some of our best information actually comes from the Caribbean spiny lobster, where we have a better understanding of how they use the geomagnetic field in their magnetic map sense. And more recently, we've had aquarium studies that have identified a size dependency in responses to strong magnets. Following the understanding of the Caribbean spiny lobster, that prompted us to look at the American lobster to establish if they were able to respond to cable EMFs. And through mesocosm studies, we established that they changed their exploratory behaviour and spatial distributions in response to a DC cable. Later, we had studies of the European lobster, so on their juvenile stages, and they did not respond to a gradient of EMF presented to them through Helmholtz coils. And so this slide actually captures some of the variation that can be identified, which could be down to species differences, or it could be identified through differences in the life stages that have been studied, or it could well be the methods that have been adopted to establish the effects. There's also known effects on crabs. So, for example, aquarium studies of magnetic fields have shown changes in sheltering behaviour when exposed to magnetic fields, and stronger fields exposed or changed the hormonal levels as well. In comparison to that, we've had field studies in the US of rock crabs, which demonstrated no difference in response to a powered or unpowered cable. And they also established that the crabs could move through the electromagnetic field to obtain food, and concluded that they'd be unlikely to change their catchability. And so that was to indicate that they could still be caught even if the cable EMF was there. Moving on to bentho-pelagic species, as I indicated earlier, a lot of our information comes from elasmobranchs, and we have established through aquarium studies that their ability to detect bioelectric fields starts very early on. Through studies of cat sharks, we have identified that they are able to differentiate between AC and DC fields, but not necessarily differentiate between artificial and natural fields. We've also shown that they are able to memorise some of the responses that they've had, so they can habituate to feeding experiments and exposures. However, that the memory response is actually quite short, so it doesn't last into the long-term memory. And recently with the skate studies, we have identified that skates and rays are able to respond to AC and DC fields, and they're able to change, or they do change, their exploratory and foraging behaviour in response to cable EMFs. Focusing now on migratory species, there's some really interesting work actually on sockeye salmon, where they showed that they changed their migration path in response to the secular variations of the geomagnetic field. And following in that similar path, we have information from Chinook salmon smolts where they responded to the DC cable, and that was the Trans-Bay cable in San Francisco, and they increased their the increased misdirection, and also the delay in the reaching the sea during their migration paths. And similarly with eels, we have some information most recently from natural experiments in the aquarium that have identified that they have a tidally dependent magnetic compass that they rely on as glass eels. And looking at later life stages, so silver eels, they were shown to slow down as they pass over a DC cable. And we have an ongoing study looking at eel migrations as they pass over a DC cable as well. And so from that volume of information, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but it is a lot of information that I have touched on very briefly there. Be surprised perhaps to hear me describe that as a patchwork of information. But actually what we have is a whole variety of species which have been studied in a number of different ways, and also using different endpoints. And we'll just briefly explore the methods that have been used there. So those studies actually demonstrated that you can have in situ, so free-ranging experiments identifying how animals respond as they move over cable EMFs. or you could have animals exposed to an EMF in a mesocosm, which is a semi-controlled field experiment. Or you can take species into an aquarium setting and actually separate the EMF components. You can expose them to the electric field or the magnetic field and have more controlled settings in that way. And then within each of these techniques, you can also have a range of exposures. So you can expose them to AC or DC fields, or you can manipulate the geomagnetic field. You can look at a range of intensities. So the studies that I identified there looked from responses from nanotesla through to microtesla, all the way up to millitesla. There's also a degree of spatial variability in how the EMF is presented to the animals. So you could have a uniform field, or you could have a gradient of electromagnetic field, or either component. And there is a degree of temporal variability as well. So by way of example, our mesocosm experiments, we used exposures of 12 to 24 hours. And if you were to take animals into the aquarium, then you have more control over that. You could have exposures for an hour, or you could increase that to a week. And so as we pull on this information and try to get what we can from this patchwork of information, we really have to be asking the key question, which is, how is this information relevant to the offshore wind and the cable EMFs that are presented to species? How can we use that information, and also how can we use these methods going forward to build on that information? In addition to that, when we think about electromagnetic fields in the marine environment, they're not something that occur in isolation. And so we may have to consider electromagnetic fields in addition to artificial reef effects. Some cables will present artificial reef effects, or that may come from the turbine foundations themselves. Or in the case of floating wind, then you may have aggregations that occur around the devices, which may well increase their exposures to electromagnetic fields. And so when we design these studies, we have to take that into effect, and in some cases we'll need to separate those factors to truly understand how animals respond to the electromagnetic field. And then when you consider the full context of the offshore wind farm and what that presents, you may have to consider other pressures that are presented to the species in unison. So I also wanted to highlight that electromagnetic fields are an operational effect. It's something that will occur when the wind farm or whatever energy source is in operation and when energy is being transferred. I pulled this quote from the OSPAR report in 2010, which is actually quite old now, but I think it's still valid. We do still need to understand the effects more of heat emissions and electromagnetic fields, as well as the impacts of burial and removal on marine organisms. I think we do have a tendency to focus on the habitat disturbance, and I'm actually surprised at the number of reports that I look at for habitat disturbance relating to cables that don't consider electromagnetic fields. And I think perhaps that's something that we could encapsulate with that, since if you actually take the vantage point of the receptive species, a change in their sensory environment is a change in their habitat. And so with that, I wanted to highlight as well that the energy emissions into the environment are something that we're required to look at. Under the MFSD, descriptor 11, we are expected to understand how energy emissions influence marine organisms. And so EMF is just one type of energy emissions, although there's not that much information available as to how that affects marine life. And to date, most studies have actually focused on underwater noise. And I think this would also be a good time to point out that there are no standards for electromagnetic field emissions in the marine environment. And so there's nothing to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. It's just something that happens. And then, so it's also applicable to the Habitats Directive. So again, highlighting some of the pertinent text there. For the species that are listed in Annex 4, we are required to understand the disturbances that we cause, particularly through certain periods of their life cycles. And so a change in their environment, such as a disturbance or a destruction, or some kind of deterioration that could be caused by these energy emissions, could be important through these legal mechanisms. In addition to that, we have to take into consideration the fishing community and their concerns regarding offshore wind farms and the expansion of these developments. And that's something that I've heard quite a lot about in the US context, where offshore wind is not not as advanced, but it's certainly something that will become a real feature in the future, in the near future as well. And they have raised concerns about the impacts that electromagnetic fields may have on the species that they consider to be really important to them. When I'm asked about impacts of EMF, it's actually something that's very difficult to answer. And so many of the studies that I highlighted to you are actually talking about an effect. So they've managed to identify a change or a response, usually in terms of a behavioural or physiological response, but they don't necessarily indicate the ecological magnitude or significance of that change. However, even minor changes, if they come together through multiple exposures or multiple encounters of the cable, could lead to cumulative effects, which when pulled together can lead to changes that are applicable over broad spatial and temporal scales. And as we start to understand that more, then we'll have a better ability to understand the environmental impacts in terms of how a species population could be influenced by electromagnetic fields. And so from the knowledge base that we presently have, so our current knowledge base, which I've described as a patchwork, I'd like to explore now how we can get to a more desirable knowledge base, which would enable us to make more informed assessments as to what electromagnetic fields may mean to our marine species. And I think that has to come from both sides, and that has to really be built upon from our understanding of the species and their responses to electromagnetic fields, but it also has to come from characterization of the electromagnetic fields and how it's presented to them. So when I showed this diagram earlier, we focused on the receptor species and the layers of information that were required to understand how those species respond to their sensory environment. But there's also characteristics that define the EMF properties, and we need more information on them as well. So just briefly going through some of those topics and how we can improve on that knowledge base, focusing on the electromagnetic field itself first. The cable properties are something that will influence the EMF and how it's emitted into the marine environment. There are a number of different cables that are in use at the moment, and that's likely to change as well with the new developments for dynamic cabling. And in addition to that, you'll have different configurations and cables and their EMFs may well interact with each other in cable corridors and such like. So understanding the cable properties and configurations would be beneficial to that knowledge base. In addition to that, the power that's transmitted through the cable will influence the electromagnetic field that's emitted into the environment. So understanding the variation in power transmission, so the generation and how that's transmitted to the grid, and the temporal change in that will inform us of the spatial temporal changes in the electromagnetic field that the animals may be exposed to. And by understanding that, we'd be able to update models to be more contextually relevant to the offshore wind farm and the effects database as well. Of course, measuring the electromagnetic fields would be very beneficial, and that would allow us to update our models. So for example, with our study, we learned that there was an AC field, but the model didn't incorporate that because we didn't know it existed until we measured it. Magnetometers are available, and electro sensors tend to be bespoke. So this is an example of the SEMLA, which we use to take our measurements. It's a towed device. So the technology does exist to measure both components in unison and in 3 dimensions. And that would be highly beneficial going forward to inform us as to what the realistic EMF emissions are, and also to update the models on those findings. And of course, when we collect data, it would be really beneficial if we were able to share it. There's no requirement to collect data on EMFs at the moment, and there's no standards for the way in which they're reported. So encouraging and facilitating data sharing on this topic would be really useful. Moving on to the species side of things. We heard earlier that the ability to sense the bioelectric fields started very early in the life stages. And so we need to establish whether or not that's something that could be changed through the cable electromagnetic fields, or if they are responsive to cable electromagnetic fields in the same way. and also if there's any developmental issues that come from early life stage exposures. And in addition to that, again, focusing on the early life stages, the larvae and juvenile, identifying the appropriate responses to study and the consequences in the life stages that are likely to come into contact with the cable EMFs would be really important. And for both of these life stages and for adults as well, sensitivity thresholds would be very useful. So actually knowing what levels that they're responsive to. We know from some species, such as elasmobranchs, that some intensities of electromagnetic fields may invoke an attraction response, and much larger intensities may invoke a avoidance response, but we don't know how that translates to other species and life stages. In addition to that, where we have information on migration, so species that are undertaking long distance migrations or even localised homing, how often are they likely to come into contact with cables? And for each cable that they come into contact with, will they slow down or experience misdirection? And we need to establish what the consequences of that may be. And so where we have indications of changes in movement or activity, so in lobsters and skates, we demonstrated a change in their exploratory and foraging behaviour. We need to consider how that actually influences the ecological function and what that means for them in terms of bioenergetics. So for example, if a skate is foraging over a cable EMF, but there's no food return because it's not a prey item, what is the consequence of that? And then the encounter rate, as we talked about earlier, will inform us as to how often species are likely to come into contact with cables, and will also give us an indication as to whether or not they're likely to learn. That's something that can be established experimentally as well. And in terms of the encounter rate, you may want to consider that in larger scales, such as movements around the UK, or you may want to consider it at a smaller scale, actually, as an animal moves through a wind farm and comes into contact with the inter-array cables, or in the case of the export cables, if there's a high density when they come into contact with that, then how does that influence their behaviours? And that's applicable through different life stages as well. And so we have called this the desired knowledge base because we realise that there's it's multifaceted. There's many things, many questions that can be asked and answered. And in order to improve the knowledge base to this level, both from the point of view of the receptive species and the electromagnetic field, it would take a multidisciplinary approach and a good deal of knowledge exchange between different sectors as well. And that brings me to the end of my talk. So I'll just take a brief moment to acknowledge my colleagues that have participated in my recent publications. I'd also like to thank our funders. So they are Bureau of Ocean Energy Management have funded our past projects and also our present projects. And I'd also like to thank you all for listening. And with that, I think we can probably move on to the Q&A session.
Yes. Hi, Zoe. Thank you for that talk. You covered so many species and so many different topics. So well done for cramming that all in. That was fantastic. And we are going to start doing those questions that have been submitted. So if you already haven't submitted your question and you're watching on Zoom, please click that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and you'll be able to submit your question there or see questions that have already been submitted by other audience members. If you're watching on YouTube, then please just type that question into the live chat and I'll be able to pass that over to Zoe as well. So I'm going to start with the top question, Zoe, and that is from Kate. Oh, wait, people are upvoting. This is fantastic. So I'm going to start with Ashley. Which is, let's go with that. Considering everything you know and the impacts, what types of mitigation and management techniques need to be implemented?
Okay, so mitigation is an interesting question, actually. So presently, the cables are protected for the protection of the cable. So it's to reorder them. Sorry, it's to the mitigation. So if the cable is buried or if it's protected with rock armouring or a cable mattressing, then that is actually to protect the cable from damage. But it also increases the distance from source. And so there are some suggestions that that is a mitigation for the EMF that's emitted. However, in many cases, the increase in distance from source that would come from rock dump or cable mattressing is not particularly large. And I think the maximum depth that you can bury a cable to is actually 2 meters. What we don't know is whether or not the increase in distance from source, which effectively reduces the intensity that the animal can be exposed to, we don't know if that actually reduces the effect in the animal. And so understanding the sensitivity thresholds or the intensities that different animals would be responsive to would be really beneficial in terms of informing the mitigation. It could be that you could combine different mitigations that I just referred to. So in terms of the burial or the rock dumping and mattressing, you could maybe combine burial and rock armouring to increase the distance from source even more if burial is not deemed to be sufficient. There are alternatively, you could work with engineers to actually change the cable properties and reduce the electromagnetic fields that are emitted. There are some cables that are capable of a degree of self-cancelling of the electromagnetic field. However, I think the important part there is that it's the degree of self-cancelling, it's not necessarily eliminating it.
Great, thank you. And our next question I'm going to go with is from Kate. What are your thoughts regarding the potential for EMF effects on marine mammals?
Probably not the best person to answer that, but I'll offer what I can. Mammals can use electromagnetic fields as well, so they do have the ability to use the geomagnetic field. I think from that perspective, it would be about their interaction with the offshore wind farms or the cables. So they're perhaps more likely to come into contact with floating wind farms, and so knowing their paths would be useful in that context. There have been events of changes in geomagnetic fields, so natural events that have caused strandings, but I think that's very different to cable EMFs.
Okay, I think that really relates to the next question that I'm going to ask, which is from Julio. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name, who asks, do you think that the increase of offshore wind generation capacity could be contributing to the increase in the frequency and intensity of cetacean strandings registered in recent years?
I'm not sure. I don't study marine mammals in the same way. My work has been very much focused on benthic and bentho-pelagic species. It is an interesting question though. So perhaps that's something that we could discuss with someone who knows more about cetaceans.
Excellent. And so we had a question that came in from John asking, would the EMF from an LED torch getting used to candle images of cat, shark, eggs be significant or even harm that? I don't know if that's at all anything that you cover or if you have any knowledge about.
No. I'm not familiar with the type of EMF that comes from an LED torch, so I think I'll reserve judgment on that, please.
Yeah, that's fine. Next question, we're going to go with Danielle again, which is, how receptive have energy companies or governments been to incorporating this research into their practice? Do you think that proposed mitigation measures would be broadly accepted by all stakeholders?
That is a difficult one to answer. I think that electromagnetic fields tend not to get a great deal of attention, partly because we haven't been able to demonstrate there has been no demonstration of a really acute impact. So as I explained in the talk, we're very much trying to elucidate the effects and build on that knowledge base at the moment. So for it to be taken seriously and involved in that, I think they really want evidence of an impact, and that can be difficult to provide based on the information that we've got at the moment. It is a question that we're asked frequently though. It is just a difficult one to answer based on the information that's available to us.
Mm-hmm. Understood. The next question is going to be from Marion, and that is the cable technology there yet for these EMF cancelling cables? could we currently ask developers to use them?
So I think that the cables that have the ability to for a degree of self-cancellation in some cases are in use. And I think we did measure like the Block Island wind farm cable did demonstrate a degree of self-cancellation. But even though that was demonstrated, it was still a measurable electromagnetic field at biologically relevant scales. So I think there's definitely a conversation to be had with cable technology people, so from that industry, and how that could potentially be improved. Cable properties would certainly influence the electromagnetic field, and so I think there probably is scope to work on the technology to improve that, but there has to be an incentive to do that, as would be my push.
Understood. Our next question is now from Thomas. Can you or your team recommend minimum monitoring requirements to developers and regulators?
Well, I think the word monitoring is a little difficult to work with. So if I ignore the monitoring aspect of that for the moment, which is a little loaded, and focus on what would be useful, then I think that making the models available, so if the cable EMFs are modelled, then making that information available and verifying those models with measurements in the field would be incredibly useful, both for the electric and the magnetic field, and also the interaction with the geomagnetic field. If that information was available, then that would make our job a lot easier in terms of trying to understand the effects on marine species, or develop experiments that allow us to make those assessments.
Next question from Grant. How applicable is terrestrial-based research on EMF to effects in the marine environment?
Applicable in some ways. However, the electromagnetic field in the marine environment is quite different. So particularly because it's in a conductive medium, and so the magnetic field. So if you think back to when I was explaining the different components of the electromagnetic field, the motionally induced electric field, or the conductivity of the induced electric field from an AC cable, would travel much further. So I think the spatial properties and spatial temporal properties are quite different. Have to be careful about generalizations in that regard.
Yeah, understood. Next question, we've got plenty more to work through. So next question is from Tony. Thanks for the interesting talk. You say that some species can detect or respond to the EMF, but is there any evidence of negative impacts on species? The IEA OES State of the Science report in 2020 says that the potential impact is very low. It is worrying if implied impacts are presented which could influence permitting authorities to prevent developing.
Okay, so I think if I'm correct in the report that he's referring to, then the State of the Science report was very much focused on the development of wave and tidal energy, and was focused largely on the development of single devices. So the idea of getting devices into the water and not holding up early stage developments. I think even the report, Copping et al. And did release a paper in 2020 that, although they highlighted that for single devices, EMF impact could be minimised, or isn't necessarily a consenting issue for a single device, they did identify that for larger scale arrays, or for multiple arrays, then the cumulative impacts were still a consideration. We don't really have the information available to say whether or not there is an impact, and so that's why we're very much still trying to figure out the effects. If we don't know the effects and how animals are able to respond to this, then we can't make conformed assessments as to potential impacts. A lack of evidence because we haven't looked or done the appropriate assessments isn't evidence of no effect or no impact.
Okay. Aware of time, so we're going to work through some of these remaining questions, and if we still have a couple left, we're going to go just over 2 o'clock, but do keep submitting those questions in if you want, and if we have lots left, Zoe and I will go through these soon afterwards to make sure that we cover everyone's questions. The next question is from Mike, which is, how does the developing elasmobranch tell you that it senses the field?
Okay, it took me a minute or two to understand that question, but so it's actually a really interesting study by, I think there's been a couple now, but Ball et al. In 2016 was the most recent one. And they exposed the developing embryo to artificial bioelectric field. And they were able to use, I think it was videography that they used to see the tail beat. And the tail beat frequency is actually an indication of ventilation behaviour. And so when they were exposed to the artificial predator bioelectric field, the tail beat frequency stopped. So it was actually a freeze response. So it was like they detected the predator, and then through their behavioural movements, they actually made themselves less, like, they kind of, like, they stopped their behaviour so that they couldn't be detected by the predator. So it's like a freeze response. And then so that would start again after a certain period of time, and then it could be repeated. So very cool study.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Our next question is going to be from Chloe, which is, do you have an idea of the realistic amount of time required to reach the desired knowledge base? Do you think there is enough time for this? Or are you feeling apprehensive about the increase in the rate of offshore energy developments appearing? That's a really interesting question.
No, I don't have a realistic time. I think there's many questions in there that can be answered. They would keep many people busy for the majority of their careers if we were to do that. That said, there are things that are certainly achievable and within our reach in a short time frame. And there are a number of scientists that work in this field now as well. So it's certainly achievable. Of course, when you ask questions, you have more questions. So I do think that it'll be a long, like, there's many questions to be answered, but I think we can make a dent in it. And I'm not necessarily worried about the offshore wind farm development, but I would like to see this is something that is explored so that we're not causing more issues as we develop this.
Mm-hmm. So we need lots of scientists with lots of funding looking at this, and then we can shorten that time
Yeah,
frame.
you know, the never-ending money tree would be useful. No, I think there's a good balance. Like, there's definitely things that we can achieve in the short term, and then some things would be a more longer-term approach. So.
Yes. The next question I'm going to take is Chloe's, which says, "Hi Zoe, great talk. She is currently studying the organism and ecological impacts of electrofishing. She's hoping to measure and characterize the electric field generated by the electrode arrays used by the fishers. But you mentioned that electrosensors of this sort of work are usually bespoke. How easy was it for you to obtain the instrumentation that you used for this work?"
Well, it was really easy because we had an expert build it for us and they'd already tried and tested it. So I was in a rather good position there. The electrosensors are bespoke. I think perhaps the arrangement of them is also something, like, you can't just take an item off the shelf and pop it in the water. So it had to be positioned in 3 dimensions, or had to take the 3-dimensional entity into consideration. I want to put a little bit of a caveat on that, because I think that the electrodes, or sorry, the electric fields that are from electrofishing are probably quite different, and so there may be other applications for that. So that's something I'd probably have to think about a little bit more. And I think I remember seeing Clive Fox had a talk on electrofishing as well, so I don't know if he had recommendations as to how that could be measured or not.
Yeah, that's true. I can't remember off the top of my head, but for Chloe, it might be worth checking out Clive's talk from the 2020 MASTS webinar series, which can be found on YouTube if you haven't already watched that. So next question is going to be from Adam, and that is, are there any studies looking at the impacts on habitat types or ecosystems as a whole rather than species? They're thinking here in particular the southern North Sea, where lots of development has occurred, including habitats such as rocky and biogenic reefs.
Impacts on habitats. Okay, so I think that I'm sure there are studies that are looking at the impacts of habitat types, and I'm not entirely sure as to the angle of the question. Habitat disturbance tends to be something that's focused on, so the installation practices of getting the cable into the seabed. To my knowledge, there's not any studies that necessarily combine the habitat disturbance and then consider operational effects of electromagnetic fields. However, what I would say is that they're not necessarily going to be detectable in community level assessments, that you probably have to be more targeted in your approach for the establishing those effects. And then ideally that information will be pulled into models of ecosystems and things like that. There are ecosystem level studies, whether or not they're specific to electromagnetic fields, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Next question, Martin, how does the AC EMF arise along a DC cable? I think this is a point that you mentioned right earlier on, which you were all a bit surprised about finding.
Oh, from the DC cable, right, yes, good question. We're still working on that. We have a few ideas. One of the ideas was that it could well be between the DC and AC transfer. So actually some of our work that we've done recently that we're still working on the results of will try and help answer that question. So we've been looking at the change in the magnetic field in the AC, all the different components as you get closer to the substations and closer to shore. So we're hoping to be able to provide more information that soon. But what I can say though is that the Neptune cable also demonstrated that. So it wasn't just something that came from one cable. And somebody has previously asked me if it was just our instrumentation, but we can confirm that that's not the case either.
Excellent. And I think we're just going to go with one more question due to time. And that is going to be from Paul. Can you detect EMF emissions from pelagic dynamic cabling? Does equipment exist for this?
I think the short answer, well, actually, that's maybe more complex. So yes, you can detect EMF. You will be able to detect EMF emissions from pelagic cables. The instrumentation to specifically go out and test that right now probably doesn't exist, particularly where you're interested in measuring the magnetic and electric components. However, it can be done, and I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested in pursuing that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I think we're going to call it there because we have just gone over time. We've got a couple of questions left, which Zoe and I can have a look at. If you have any burning questions right now, please pop them in and I will pass those over to Zoe and we can try and answer them and add that onto the recording of this webinar. So for anyone who wants to recap or look at a specific part of Zoe's talk, you will be able to find this recording on the MASTS YouTube page very soon. And we're going to be posting all those questions that we read through. We'll copy and paste those into the description of the YouTube video, so you'll be able to see exactly what we're referring to when we're going through the Q&A part of the video. There has been a comment in the chat from Jessica asking, can you provide a link to any published research to date, please? So Zoe, if there's any particular papers that you think are super cool that people should be checking out, we can put that in the video description that can be found on YouTube. So Jessica, please check out the YouTube recording when we get to uploading it, and we will include some publication links that Zoe recommends, I think.
Okay, no problem.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe, for a fantastic starter webinar for the MASTS 2021 series. Yeah, it was great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So for everyone who is still with us, I would just like to highlight that what next week's talk is all about. It is with Mark Dickey-Collis. He is from ICES, and he is going to be talking about ICES ensuring appropriate knowledge for decision making. So if you haven't already signed up and this is something that you would really like to listen to, please check out the registration link that you used to sign up for this very talk itself. Or you can always join us on YouTube for a live stream as well. We have a fantastic series of talks coming up in the next few months. These are the ones that are happening in February and March. Again, they're all free, they're always live streamed onto YouTube, and they are always recorded. So if you're unable to join on a specific date, you are more than welcome to check out on a catch-up recording of the webinar itself. And we're running all the way until the end of May. So there's lots of chances for you to delve into some more marine science if this is something that you've really enjoyed. Again, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box right now, and I'll be able to pass those over to Zoe. That's everything from us. I hope you really enjoyed today's MASTS webinar, and we look forward to you joining us in another webinar.